At 87 years old, Jane Fonda faced a loss that was more than professional, more than public. Robert Redford's passing was the end of a bond that had stretched across half a century, from the bright energy of their youth to the quiet reflections of old age. Their story began in the 1960s when audiences first saw them together in Barefoot in the park. What followed was not just a series of films but a thread woven through the fabric of Hollywood itself. Decade after decade, Jane and Robert returned to each other, sometimes playful, sometimes weary, always magnetic. They grew older in front of the world, and in doing so, they allowed the world to grow older with them. So when news spread that Redford was gone, the world turned to Jane. What would she say? How do you capture 50 years of history in a single farewell? Her words were not polished for headlines or crafted for drama. They were simple, raw and honest, and when her last goodbye reached the public, it carried the weight of an era coming to a close, leaving fans everywhere in tears. In 1967, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford stepped onto the set of Barefoot in the park. The script was simple, a newlywed couple navigating the chaos of a cramped New York apartment, but what happened on screen transcended the page. From the first scene, audiences felt something different. Their laughter seemed genuine, their bickering playful, their tenderness too natural to be rehearsed. For Jane, it was the film that changed everything. She had already begun to build a career, but working with Robert gave her something she had never quite experienced before. Decades later, reflecting on that moment, she admitted, "I feel so lucky to have made one of his first big movies with him, Barefoot in the Park." Those words weren't just nostalgia, they were her acknowledgement that this film was the beginning of a partnership that would last a lifetime. On screen, the spark was undeniable. Redford's steady reserve met Jane's spirited energy, creating a balance that audiences couldn't look away from. Off-screen, however, Jane later confessed she often felt nervous in his presence. She wanted his approval, worried about how he perceived her, and carried a self-consciousness that made her push herself harder. That quiet tension, invisible to most, gave their performances a rawness that felt real. Critics praised the film, but it was the public who made it iconic. Couples saw themselves in Jane and Robert's playful struggles, and singles imagined falling in love with someone who could make them laugh like that. For Jane, the experience planted a seed. Robert wasn't just another co-star. He was different. He was someone who brought out a side of her that she didn't even know she had. When the credits rolled on Barefoot in the park, Hollywood had discovered a pairing that felt timeless. And for Jane, it was the start of what she would later call her on-screen partnership of a lifetime. After the success of Barefoot in the Park, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford did not become a permanent Hollywood duo. Instead, their careers split in different directions, as if fate wanted to test how far they could go apart before bringing them back together. Redford leaned into the roles that would define him as one of America's most bankable stars. In Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, he became the charming outlaw. In The Sting, he turned con artistry into an art form. And in All the President's Men, he embodied the journalist's pursuit of truth, cementing his reputation as more than a handsome face. He was a cultural icon. Jane's path looked very different. She embraced risk, choosing films that demanded vulnerability and conviction. Her role in Clute won her an Academy Award, and Coming Home pushed her to the forefront of politically charged storytelling. She became known not only as a leading actress, but also as a woman unafraid to stand for something, even when it cost her. Despite their diverging paths, Hollywood kept circling them back together. In 1979, they reunited for The Electric Horseman. This was no longer the fresh, romantic energy of Barefoot in the Park. It was the story of two seasoned adults, a cowboy tired of the spotlight, and a reporter determined to find the truth, colliding in a world that demanded resilience. Audiences noticed the shift. Their chemistry hadn't dimmed, but it had deepened. Their smiles carried history, their silences spoke volumes. Viewers sensed that these weren't just characters, They were reflections of Jane and Robert themselves, older, wiser, carrying scars invisible to the script. Looking back, Jane reflected on why these reunions mattered so much to her. "He meant a lot to me, and was a beautiful person in every way," she admitted. That beauty wasn't about looks, though his charisma was undeniable. It was about the way he carried himself, his integrity, and the quiet steadiness that made her feel both challenged and safe. It was that duality, distance mixed with comfort, that kept audiences riveted. They didn't need to appear in every film together to prove their bond. Each reunion was enough to remind fans that some connections, however spaced out, endure. To the outside world, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford looked like the perfect screen couple, glamorous, effortless, timeless. But Jane was always open about the fact that their relationship behind the camera was more complicated than it appeared. She admitted that she often felt nervous working with him. Robert was reserved, sometimes hard to read, and she constantly wondered what he thought of her. Unlike other co-stars who put her at ease, Robert had a way of making her second-guess herself. "I always wanted his approval," she confessed later, "and I never quite knew if I had it." That tension wasn't a weakness. It became the fuel that gave their performances an authenticity audiences couldn't ignore. Where Jane was outspoken, expressive, and willing to spill her heart, Robert was guarded. He rarely revealed what he was feeling. Yet this contrast created the magic of their pairing. Their chemistry wasn't sugary or staged. It had texture. It was the collision of openness and reserve, of vulnerability and strength. Over time, Jane came to respect that Robert's quietness wasn't distance so much as conviction. He had a strong sense of self and of what mattered. Reflecting after his death, she summed it up in words that felt both personal and universal. "He stood for an America we have to keep fighting for." To Jane, Robert wasn't just a talented actor. He was a man who represented integrity, fairness, and the kind of principles that seemed increasingly rare. That was why she cared so much about his opinion. It wasn't just admiration for his talent, it was reverence for his values. When he was beside her on screen, she wasn't only acting with a co-star, she was measuring herself against a standard she deeply respected. Despite the insecurities, Jane always said Robert was the co-star she loved working with most. She called him her true partner, the man whose presence anchored her through decades of change. Their bond wasn't about constant closeness or easy friendship. It was about the rare understanding that comes from building something bigger than either of them could on their own. On screen, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford seemed effortless together. But away from the cameras, both were navigating personal battles that shaped not only who they were, but how they met each other in those quiet, unspoken moments on set. Jane's life was marked by turbulence. Her marriages carried her through vastly different worlds: the glitter of Roger Vadim's Paris, the activism of Tom Hayden's political campaigns, the empire-like shadow of Ted Turner's media dynasty. Each union left its mark, sometimes lifting her, sometimes breaking her, but always reshaping how she understood herself. She was not simply an actress balancing scripts and sets. She was a woman carrying public scrutiny, activism, and personal doubt all at once. Robert's life carried a quieter grief. He and Lola Van Wagenen divorced after decades of marriage. But even before that, he bore the scar of losing an infant son, a tragedy he seldom spoke about. He was admired, even idolized, yet his guarded nature left many wondering how much loneliness lived beneath the surface. Instead of turning outward, Robert poured himself into his work, not only his acting, but his directing, and the creation of the Sundance Institute, where he gave young filmmakers opportunities he had never been offered. This was what Jane admired most. In her tribute after his death, she said Bob made a real difference in all good ways. She wasn't speaking only of his films. She was speaking of the man who built something lasting, who used his fame not for vanity, but for legacy. Jane understood struggle. She understood reinvention. and she saw in Robert a man who endured heartbreak and difficulty, yet still chose to create, to give, to build. Their struggles sometimes made their reunions charged with emotion. They weren't carefree lovers frozen in youth. They were two people who had lived and lost, who carried the weight of broken marriages, political wars, and family complexities into every scene. That weight was visible. It gave their later collaborations a resonance that no script could manufacture. Audiences didn't always know the details of their private lives, but they could sense it. The tenderness in their silences, the depth in their glances, it was born of experience. And that was why Jane's admiration of Robert never wavered. He wasn't perfect, neither was she, but together they embodied something rare in Hollywood: authenticity born of survival. By the time Jane Fonda and Robert Redford reunited for Our Souls at Night in 2017, both were in their late 70s. To see them together again, decades after Barefoot in the Park, felt like watching time collapse. Two people carrying half a century of history, stepping once more into each other's orbit. The project wasn't a blockbuster, nor was it designed for spectacle. It was a quiet Netflix drama, modest in scale, but profound in impact. The story was deceptively simple. Two widowed neighbors, weary of silence and loneliness, decide to spend their nights together. Not for passion, but for companionship. It was about the courage to admit the human need for closeness, even in life's final chapters. There were no dazzling set pieces, no high drama. Instead, the film lingered on small gestures, the comfort of shared silence, the bravery of letting someone into your solitude, the tenderness of late-life love. For Jane, the experience was personal. She later reflected, "I feel so lucky to have made one of his first big movies with him, Barefoot in the Park, and his last, Our Souls at Night." That pairing of first and last became the bookends of a story bigger than either of them could have scripted. They had begun their journey as bright, nervous newcomers and ended it as seasoned artists who carried the marks of age, loss, and survival. On set, the chemistry was not the nervous energy of youth, nor the playful sparring of middle age. It was something gentler, more fragile, yet more profound. Jane admitted she no longer worried about what Robert thought of her, though a trace of that old self-consciousness still lingered. What mattered now was presence. Standing beside him felt like closure, not of their friendship, but of the circle that began in 1967. Robert, too, seemed changed. Known throughout his career for his reserve, in Our Souls at Night he allowed himself to be tender in ways audiences had rarely seen before. His performance was stripped of ego, stripped of the aloofness that once defined him. There was vulnerability in his pauses, warmth in his touches, a quiet plea in his silences. Watching him opposite Jane was not simply watching characters. It was witnessing two lives that had run parallel, finally converging one last time. Critics praised the film's honesty, but it was audiences who gave it its true meaning. For many, watching Jane and Robert together in their twilight years was like seeing old friends share one final dance. Fans who had discovered them in the 60s now watched them close the loop. They weren't pretending to be young again. They were showing what it meant to grow old with dignity, with longing, and with a surprising, hopeful tenderness. The film also carried an unspoken awareness. This might be the end. Neither Jane nor Robert announced it that way, but the undertones were clear. When she leaned against him, when he looked at her with weary affection, audiences felt it. This was goodbye, not to each other personally, but to the decades-long story they had told together on screen. In hindsight, Jane's words made it clear she saw it that way, too. That film wasn't just another project, it was their final gift to audiences. First and last. Two films spanning 5 decades, with all the life, loss, and lessons in between. For Jane, Our Souls at Night was not only a role, it was a way of saying farewell to Robert as her partner, to their shared history, and to the version of herself that had grown up beside him. It was fitting that Robert retired soon after, leaving this as his last major screen role. What better ending could there have been? A love story about loneliness and connection, played by two people who had spent their lives circling one another, always apart, but never far. And for the millions who watched, it felt less like a film and more like closure. When news of Robert Redford's death broke, the world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just the loss of a film star, it was the departure of a man whose presence had defined American cinema for more than half a century. For audiences who grew up in the 60s and 70s, his face was as familiar as family. The blonde hair, the steady gaze, the mix of charm and principle that made him more than an actor. For younger generations, he was the elder statesman, a symbol of a Hollywood that still carried dignity. The tributes came instantly. Colleagues spoke of his artistry and influence. Directors recalled how he elevated every set he touched. Fellow actors described a man who never sought attention, yet commanded it by sheer presence. Politicians and activists remembered his commitment to environmentalism and truth-telling. Martin Scorsese called him a visionary, while filmmakers across the world thanked him for building the Sundance Institute, the platform that gave countless storytellers their first chance. But the most telling tributes came from ordinary people. Fans wrote about seeing him on first dates at drive-in theaters, or sitting beside their parents in dark cinemas watching The Sting. They described introducing their own children to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, passing down not just a movie, but a memory. Redford's films weren't just entertainment, they were rituals, stitched into the lives of millions. His death didn't just close a career, it closed chapters in personal histories everywhere. For Jane Fonda, the loss was piercingly personal. As tributes filled newspapers and television screens, the world waited for her voice. Few could claim a connection as deep or as enduring as hers. She and Robert had grown up together on screen, carried each other through youthful comedy, mature romance, and late-life tenderness. To hear her perspective would be to understand not just Robert Redford the actor, but Robert Redford the man. When she finally spoke, her words were raw, almost startling in their honesty. "It hit me hard this morning, when I read that Bob was gone. I can't stop crying." There was no pretense, no carefully crafted statement. It was grief, unfiltered. Her sorrow was not polished for the public. It was the kind that comes when someone who has always been there suddenly isn't. She went on to call him a beautiful person in every way. That phrase spoke volumes. Jane had known Robert in ways most never could. She had seen his discipline, his aloofness, his occasional distance. But she had also seen the man behind the reserve, the flashes of humor, the moments of kindness, the quiet decency that never demanded recognition. In those words, she offered fans a glimpse into the Robert Redford they had always suspected, but never truly knew. Jane also made clear that Robert's significance extended beyond film. "He stood for an America we have to keep fighting for," she said, her voice carrying conviction. To her, he embodied a set of values, integrity, fairness, honesty, that felt increasingly rare. He was more than a performer. He was a reminder of what art and what a life could represent. But her reflections weren't only about his public impact, they were about the arc they had shared together. "I feel so lucky to have made one of his first big movies with him, Barefoot, in the park, and his last, Our Souls at Night." That acknowledgement transformed her tribute into something profound. She wasn't just mourning a colleague, she was grieving the bookends of a shared story. The nervous beginning of youth, and the reflective close of old age. Few people ever get to see such symmetry. Jane lived it. And then came the most human admission of all regret. "I was wanting to go see him these last few months, but I didn't act on it soon enough." Lesson learned. In those words, Jane offered not only her grief, but her vulnerability. She confessed to the same mistakes so many make, assuming there will always be more time. That regret cut through the glamour of Hollywood and reached straight into the hearts of ordinary people. Fans wept not only for Robert, but for their own postponed phone calls, their own missed visits, their own unfinished goodbyes. Her tribute spread quickly across the world. Headlines pulled quotes, but it was the emotion behind them that stayed with people. Fans described breaking down in tears as they read her words, feeling that Jane had captured the loss they themselves were struggling to articulate. Her honesty became a collective outlet for mourning. Robert Redford's passing closed a monumental career, but through Jane Fonda's eyes, it became something even more intimate. It wasn't just about films or fame or legacy. It was about partnership, about two people who carried each other through decades of change, and how one was left behind to tell the story when the other was gone. When Jane Fonda finally spoke about Robert Redford's death, her words carried a rawness that made them unforgettable. She had stayed quiet at first, letting the world's tributes fill the air, but everyone knew her voice would be different. No one else had walked the same path with him, from their very first steps into stardom to his final film before retirement. And when her statement came, it was not grand or poetic. It was stripped bare, as though she could only manage the truth. It hit me hard this morning when I read that Bob was gone. I can stop crying. That was the beginning of her farewell. 16 words that revealed more than paragraphs of polished eulogies ever could. They showed the private reality of grief. This wasn't Jane the icon, Jane the activist, Jane the veteran actress. This was Jane the friend, blindsided by the loss of someone whose presence had been a constant through the rhythm of her own life. Her words carried an intimacy the public wasn't expecting. She didn't open with his resume, his awards, or even their most famous roles together. She opened with her tears. That alone reminded people that behind the glamour of Hollywood are human beings who feel loss just as deeply as anyone else. Jane's honesty gave fans permission to cry too. She continued, "He meant a lot to me, and was a beautiful person in every way." Those who had followed their films knew what she meant. Robert had always been admired for his looks, but Jane's choice of words went deeper. She wasn't talking about his famous face or his presence on a poster. She was speaking of the man she had known when the cameras weren't rolling, the man whose steadiness anchored her when she felt insecure, whose quiet gestures carried more weight than spoken praise, whose decency revealed itself in the smallest of ways. To Jane, Robert's beauty was moral as much as physical. And then she placed his life in a wider frame. He stood for an America we have to keep fighting for. This wasn't a throwaway line. Jane has always been outspoken, never shying from politics. And here she was using her farewell to remind people of what Robert represented. He wasn't just a screen idol, he was a man who chose to use his influence to stand for something larger. Through his work at Sundance, through the integrity of his roles, through his very posture in the industry, he embodied a vision of America that was principled, fair, and hopeful. By tying his memory to those values, Jane elevated her goodbye into a call to honor what he had stood for. But perhaps the most poignant part of her tribute was her reflection on their shared history. "I feel so lucky to have made one of his first big movies with him, Barefoot in the Park, and his last, Our Souls at Night." In those words, Jane marked the arc of their story, first and last, nervous youth and reflective age, playful comedy and tender farewell. Few partnerships in film history can claim that kind of symmetry. For Jane, it was more than professional pride. It was gratitude. Gratitude for having walked with him across decades, through the shifting currents of Hollywood and of life itself. Fans who read that line felt the enormity of it. 50 years, distilled into a pairing of beginnings and endings. And then came the moment that made her farewell universal, her admission of regret. "I was wanting to go see him these last few months, but I didn't set act on it soon enough. Lesson learned." That single sentence cut to the heart. It was not just Jane mourning Robert, it was Jane mourning what she had not done, the time she had let slip away. Everyone who has ever postponed a visit, delayed a call, or told themselves soon felt the sting of those words. Her honesty gave the world a mirror, reflecting back the fragility of human connection. Fans wrote that this line alone brought them to tears, because it wasn't just her lesson, it was theirs. Her goodbye spread across headlines, but it was the quiet tone of it that lingered. It was not theatrical. It was not polished for cameras. It was the voice of a woman who had loved, worked beside, sparred with, and admired Robert Redford for over half a century, finally facing the reality that he was gone. And that is why Jane's farewell became more than a tribute. It became closure, not only for her, but for everyone who had followed their story. Fans described feeling as though she had spoken for them, that her words put into sentences what they were too overwhelmed to say. She had given them permission to grieve, and in doing so she turned her private loss into a collective one. In the end, Jane's last goodbye was not about recounting his achievements. It was about honoring the man, the partner, and the symbol he had become. It was about admitting that loss leaves holes we cannot fill, and that love, in whatever form it takes, never truly ends. Her words carried the intimacy of friendship, the respect of partnership, and the ache of unfinished moments. For Jane, the farewell was deeply personal. For the world, it was the final chapter of one of Hollywood's greatest pairings. And as her voice trembled with both gratitude and regret, millions felt their own tears fall, not just for Robert Redford, but for the reminder that all goodbyes come too soon. The story of Jane Fonda and Robert Redford was never just about movies. It was about two lives that intersected across 5 decades, returning to one another at pivotal moments, in youth, in maturity, and in old age. Their films weren't only stories on screen, they became reflections of time itself, capturing the innocence of beginnings, the weight of middle years, and the tenderness of farewells. When Robert passed, the world remembered him as the Sundance Kid, the con man of the sting, the truth seeker of all the president's men. But Jane's words reminded us of something deeper. To her, he was not just an icon, he was a partner, steady, complicated, sometimes distant, always present. He was a man who stood for values that outlived the glamour of Hollywood. Her final goodbye was more than tribute. It was closure. It was the raw voice of someone who had loved, lost, and carried regret. A reminder to all of us not to wait for someday to tell the people who matter what they mean. That honesty is what left the world in tears. Together, Jane Fonda and Robert Redford gave us one of cinema's most enduring partnerships. And in her last farewell, Jane gave us a gift, a way to say goodbye not just to Robert, but to the eras, the stories, and the memories he carried with him. For more emotional stories, check out this video.